All right,
I'm really excited to be
welcome.
here.
We only have 45 minutes, and like there's a ton of questions I would love to ask you. So let's jump straight into it. Maybe for our viewers, let me just briefly introduce you. And looking at your really impressive resume, you co-founded Justin TV, which most of our viewers know as Twitch, which was sold to close to $1 billion to Amazon. You also co-founded SocialCam. And currently you serve as a partner and CEO of a core unit of the Y Combinator. But what I found really interesting in your resume was that you actually studied political science, right? So I'm curious to know, do you think this was kind of an obstacle to your entrepreneurial journey, or was it sort of like a secret weapon?
Neither.
All right.
So what I would say is that school was an extremely large help. I went to Yale University, and it was a great help because I met my best friend and co-founder Justin Kahn there. I would say from an academic perspective, I could have really studied anything. I don't think much was very relevant to my startup career, other than if I decided to be a CS major, which back then at my school, there were only 10 CS majors a year. It wasn't very popular in 2005. But yeah, otherwise, I don't think my major had much to do with anything.
Right, because many founders without technical background are struggling with this. Like, can I actually find a company if I don't know computer science and this and that? But I think you're a great example that this is not really the case.
Well, let's be clear. I think that there are a lot of people when they are young who don't understand how valuable it is to make technical friends. And I think that one of the things that happens in college a lot is that the skills that are perhaps valued at the university are not the skills that are actually valuable afterwards. And so sometimes students in the university will study certain things or will make friends with certain groups of people and then realize 5-10 years later how they kind of hurt themselves. I was really lucky. This wasn't planned, but I made friends who were technical, and that was extremely helpful. So I do think not being technical would have been a massive barrier to me getting into this space had I not had close technical friends. Right.
So Y Combinator was always pretty international, but looking at the latest batches of YC companies, it seems that you're backing more and more international founders, and specifically founders that are actually building for their domestic markets. So is this something driven by YC, or this is just reflecting on the kind of sort of changing in behavior of entrepreneurs of how they build their companies?
I'm happy that you said that, because I think it really actually does reflect a change in the entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. I would say that we've always been welcoming to international founders, but over the past 5 years, we've seen an explosion of international founders wanting to build products for their home countries. I think that they're being inspired by the founders all over the world, and that's been great for us to see. I think there's been a lot of misconceptions that at YC, we don't want to support companies who aren't building for the US market, and nothing could be further from the truth. 40% of a typical YC batch now is international, and the majority of those founders are building for their home countries. So if I were to go one step deeper, as an advisor of companies, as a group partner, one thing that's been very clear is that our international founders, more often than not, have a higher calling. They believe that software and technology can be part of uplifting their country or their region. And so they take more responsibility for their environment, who they're serving, their customers, their stakeholders, the general public in their countries. They take more responsibility for that than some American founders do. And I think it's great to see. As an advisor, it's so much more fun to help someone who has a larger mission and a larger goal than just building a successful product. And so it's been a great infusion of talent, but also kind of passion into YC.
What is your experience with CE startups? Do you have any special take on CE startups? Do you even consider them as a specific separate group?
What do you mean by seed startup?
Startups coming from out of Central and Eastern Europe. So this is mostly.
Sorry. Yeah. For me, the way that I've been thinking about the startup ecosystem is that there are large markets that are available to attack, and we have startups in every region where there's a large market. And so, of course, Europe is a massive market. Of course, Middle East and Asia is a massive market. Of course, Africa is a massive market, Southeast Asia, India, China, and Latin America. And we have startups that come from every one of those regions. I think what's cool now that didn't used to be the case is that if you are a startup from anywhere in the world, you can go to the Y Combinator website. You go to ycombinator.com/companies, and you can find other startups from your country who've done YC. And so there's a lot of misconceptions about YC, but when you actually talk to alumni who've participated, you'll actually learn what the real experience is and what it's not.
Excellent. So let's talk about a sort of a typical startup journey. And most entrepreneurs are asking about kind of like how to develop the great idea, right? So everything starts with a great idea. And oftentimes investors, try to judge ideas, and I guess every investor has these founders that previously passed on, and now they become super successful, right? So I guess my question to you is, how do you actually judge these ideas, and also how should founders go about actually deciding whether the idea is worthwhile pursuing?
So I'm so happy that you said that. We don't like to judge ideas. I think that one of the things that we've learned in YC is that founders create the future. And when you invest at early stages like we do, you see worlds change, right? You see a world go from no ride share to ride share, or from no grocery delivery to grocery delivery, or no restaurant delivery to restaurant delivery, or no one understanding what Bitcoin is to everyone having a Coinbase account. Like, you see startups changing the world. And so as an investor, we have to be very, very careful that our vision of what the world's going to be doesn't get in the way of us learning what a founder's vision of what the world's going to be, because a founder has much more ability to make that world a reality than we do as investors. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I always disliked this concept of needing to start with an idea. I see too many founders fall so in love with their idea that they forget the problem they originally were solving and the customer they were originally serving. And they wake up one day and they realize they're not solving any problem. Their customers don't like them. But what they were doing was just building their idea in their head, bringing that into reality. And that's not really our job as founders. Like, our job is to actually serve our customer and solve problems. And so more often than not, your original idea is going to change because it didn't solve the problem, because it's hard to come up with a solution to a hard problem. And I think this isn't talked about enough. I think that so much of startups, they seem to go by this, public pattern. The pattern that's talked about is come up with a great idea, build it, grow, and then build a company. Well, advising hundreds, if not thousands of startups like I do, the reality is it looks nothing like that. Usually you're obsessed about some sort of problem that exists, often because you have it. And you iterate through a number of different ideas or solutions for that problem. And it might be the first idea that worked, it might be the sixth idea that works. And the number one factor in your success is your perseverance in dealing with those solutions you come up with not being successful. And I think that more often than not, founders should be picking problems that they'd be excited to build the second, the third, the fourth solution if the first solution didn't work. Too many young startup founders think that just success happens. I think a lot of that has to do with how startups are reported. Every day you can read stories about startups raising money and raising money and raising money, and you would assume that all startups, that's all they do. But in reality, it's almost nothing of what they do. And every time you read a story about a company raising money, you should always assume that there's a story about a company dying that hasn't been written.
So basically what you're saying is it's kind of a mission over idea, right? So founders should really pursue something that they truly care about. And I'm curious to actually ask you, as an investor, if you have a portfolio company that decides to put their mission in front of profit, what's your take on that?
So I love it. Remember, we're not aiming for profits today. We're aiming for the company to be around and thriving in decades to come. And I think the companies that do that best are the ones that are mission oriented. I'll give you a specific example. We funded a company in the United States named Promise, and its core mission was to reduce mass incarceration in the US. Most people around the world realize that we don't have a great criminal justice system here in the United States. Promise started by building a product for prisons and police systems. And the product made it easier for people who are arrested to not be thrown in jail awaiting their trial. It turns out in America, 60% of the people in jail are just there waiting their trial. They haven't been convicted of anything yet. So the original product solved this problem. It made it easier. Promise took over responsibility of getting them to court. And so people wouldn't have to stay in jail, lose their car, lose their job, so on and so forth. But quickly, the founder realized, this amazing founder named Phaedra, she realized that the people she was selling to didn't have the same goals as her. They were more interested in incarcerating more people, not less. And they saw her software as making them more efficient in arresting people. And she realized that that's not what her mission was. And so even though she was getting governments to sign up, she was getting counties around America to sign up, she said, that's not what I want to do. She pivoted. And I think that, that was an amazing example of, no, I'm doing this company for a specific reason. I'm not doing it to make money just to make money. I want my company to be profitable, but I also want it to make an impact on America and on the world. And so she pivoted, and she's now working on a product that makes it easier for you to pay fines, tickets, and bills from the government. It gives you free payment plans and other things that make it easier to pay. She gets much better repayment rates than most cities do. And that product is selling really great. And turns out that usually there's some friction around paying a ticket or a fine that causes someone to get mixed up in the criminal justice system in the first place. And she's cutting that out. So this is a perfect example of a founder who understood where she wanted to be at the end. And even if she was seeing success going down the wrong path, she could see it was the wrong path and she could pivot.
Well, that's a really inspiring story. So talking about problems, let's switch the question from how do you find the great idea, how do you define it, to how do you define a great problem? So is there any, framework for working with that?
Yeah, so I've been trying to come up with that because that's one of the most common questions I get from young founders. And I've come up with a couple ideas. The first idea is that everyone tells you you should solve a personal problem, right? That's kind of the common advice. But so many founders I talk to say, oh, well, I don't have any really hard personal problems. And what's interesting is when I dig into that, I realize that something very interesting is going on. If you've had a personal problem in your life for any significant period of time, you've tried a lot of solutions to solve it. And what's interesting is that in the process of trying those solutions and those solutions half working or not working at all, it's easy to convince yourself that those problems are unsolvable. So that when you go to make a list of the problems that you want to solve, you discount your personal problems because you assume they're not really solvable. Now, I'll take myself, for example. Health and weight specifically has been a problem I've had since I was a teenager. And I never started a company to solve it because I always thought it was too hard or there weren't any good solutions possible because I'd been trying for so long, personally. When in fact, all of that personal experience of the problem probably made me one of the best people to try to solve it. Yet the intimidation of the personal problem outweighed everything else, and so I never did. Now over the past year, I've lost about 60 pounds, and I now have a bunch of thoughts on how to do it, and I probably could have had those thoughts 10 years ago had I been working on a startup to do it. And so when I tell people to solve a personal problem, my advice, my kind of next piece of advice is to dig deeper and figure out those problems in your life that you fear unsolvable. And if you have those problems, I bet a lot of other people do. And it's okay for you to go after them because that's the kind of problem that's going to motivate you, even if you're failing. On the flip side, I tell people they should be very, very careful about building products where they have no experience at all. Because I'll tell you what a common failure path is. I'm not picking any problem that I know anything about. I see a problem over there. I see it's not solved. And my initial assumption is everyone who's tried to solve it is an idiot. And therefore, whatever insight comes to the top of my head, I bet that is going to break open that industry, solve that problem. And then I get to work. And then 3 months in, I realize, this is a fact I didn't know. Oh, my insight's not going to work. I'm not really passionate about this problem. I'm not part of this problem or this industry. I don't really care. And I'm realizing it's a lot harder than I thought, and that the people who came before me weren't smart. And so I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to find some other thing to work on. I'm going to find some other industry that I don't know very well, and I'm going to rinse and repeat this process. And so a lot of founders have what we call pivotitis, which is that they can't bring themselves to work on a problem that they're personally passionate about. So they keep on pivoting every 3 to 6 months because they're choosing problems they don't care about. And so I rather a founder work on a problem that they are afraid can't be solved than a founder work on a problem that they don't know well and have convinced themselves the solution is easy.
Right. And so talking about problems and how these problems are reflected in markets and like whether these businesses are really viable, what is your advice on that? How to look at these problems from this kind of market perspective?
So usually my first piece of advice on how to verify your market is to charge. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of founders have this misconception that if they're bringing a new product to market, the way to get users is to make that product free because it's not good enough yet. And I kind of like to turn that concept on its head. If your users have a problem desperately enough, they will use a shitty solution to solve it. And you, as a startup, are looking for desperate customers because desperate customers are the kind of customers who are searching the internet and will find some small startup in some corner of the world and they'll try to use the product, right? That's almost the definition of a desperate user. And so that's who you're trying to build for. And charging that person confirms that they are so desperate that they really need this problem. Getting feedback from people who you're charging means you're getting real feedback. You're not getting feedback from people that if you were to charge, they would never use your product, or your problem, that the problem you're solving isn't that significant that it's not worth any money to them. And so more often than not, that's my strong preference for founders, is to really charge early and to sometimes consider charging more. Consider positioning yourself as a premium solution. I think a lot of founders are intimidated by that, but if you're operating in spaces with old incumbents, your software might feel pretty damn premium and you shouldn't discount that.
Right. I think this is a great bridge to a kind of a next inflection point, which is an MVP or minimum viable product. So what's your thinking on, strategies founders should use when, kind of building their first MVP?
So I think founders over-index on interviews as a source of valuable customer insight, and they under-index on getting a product into people's hands. It turns out that you get real product insights and real product feedback when real product is launched, not before. And so the first thing I would tell people is just assume most of your learning will happen post MVP. And then I ask, when do you want to start learning? The second thing that I try to do is break down the idea that launches are important. A lot of founders believe their launch has to be this kind of rocket ship moment where like you go from launch to bam, you're in space. And so we have to do all this work beforehand to make sure the launch goes perfectly. One of the things that I remind these founders of is that if I were to ask them about the products that they use every day in their lives, Gmail, Google, Uber, Amazon, Facebook, Instagram, do they remember the day that any of those products were launched? No, they never do. They never do. For almost every product, especially online product that we use, we don't remember the day it was launched. And that's okay. So if I don't remember the day that Google was launched, and I was alive, I was very much alive. I was a teenager when Google launched. Why is it important for everyone to remember the day you launched? Just get something out there.
So I think in CE, but I guess this is valid for, across the world, founders usually fall in love with their product and, are kind of reluctant to release an MVP that is, just 80% of their dream, and, they continue building and building and building. But if I understand correctly, you advise founders to go out as soon as possible with an MVP. So, what is enough? What is really the minimum viable product in your view? How do you define it? Maybe it would be great to hear an example of Justin TV, for example.
So here's the scary thing. What people don't tell you about the minimum viable product is you don't know until you launch whether you have it. And so you can't just sit there and say, when I've built 90% of the things in my head, I have my minimum viable product. More often than not, the common mistake is to launch too late. So as a founder, I feel as though you should just, because you know that, you should just be cheating towards launching earlier, no matter what. For us, well, you have to remember, Twitch was like the third major iteration of our product. The second one was a platform where anyone could broadcast live video, but the first version of Twitch was actually a live stream where Justin was broadcasting his life 24/7 around the world. The minimum viable product for what we called back then life casting on Justin.tv was the ability for one person to broadcast. So we had this vision, it didn't turn out this way, that we would have many different life casters on this kind of online TV network of life casters, and they'd live all these different lives. There'd be a woman in New York, there'd be a sports player, there'd be Justin who was building a tech company, and you get to kind of live these people's lives through them because they were life casting. That was our idea. The first MVP was just a product that literally only one person could use. The first life caster, which was our co-founder, Justin. If a second person had tried to use it, everything wouldn't have worked. Like it would have been impossible for the second person to use it. But we launched it. And so I think that's a perfect example. Now, God, that was a more complicated time. Things were harder to build. It took us 4 months to build our MVP. We could probably build it now in a week of hard work. Yeah, but we understood that we didn't know what was going to happen post-launch, and so we needed to get out there as soon as possible.
So you mentioned a very interesting word, and that is you iterated. So what is the difference between iterating and pivoting?
So it's interesting. Here's how I think about it in kind of conceptual, theoretical terms, and then I'll say how I think about it practically. In conceptual or theoretical terms, Iterating means that you're keeping the person and the problem constant, which means that in every iteration, you learn more about the person and the problem, the customer and the problem, so that you can incorporate that learning into the next iteration. So that's kind of the theoretical thought. Pivoting, you're changing the customer or the problem. So some large amount of information that you learned from the last product, from the last solution, from the last thing you build, doesn't apply anymore. So if I'm running, the most basic example, so I'm running like a lawn care business and I cut people's lawns. And I decide, you know what? Being a plumber is actually my life passion. And that seems like what customers need, not lawn care service. That's a pivot, right? I'm changing the problem I'm solving. I'm not changing the customer necessarily, but I'm changing the problem I'm solving. That's a pivot. As opposed to if I'm running a lawn care service and I realize that my same customers, they need new plants installed in their front yard and they need some gardening done. And there's more that I can do for them. That's iterating, right? The problem that these people had was, how do I make the front of my house amazing? Lawn was just one part of it. That's where I started, but then I expanded into the other things to make the front of my house look amazing. In the practical, super practical world, people get frustrated by the product, the problem, or the customer, and that's what drives them to pivot. And I would really encourage you to think about your initial problem. What I say is less with your business brain and more with your heart. Your business brain, most founders' business brains are horrible, especially young founders. Their concept of what makes a good business or not is trained on like VC Twitter, bad tech articles, and like what their peers think, right? And like Shark Tank, right? It's just all bad sources for like information. So their business brains, horrible. Their hearts, the problems that they understand themselves, they lived through, right? That's well-trained. If you have a personal problem and I give you a bad solution for it, you know instantly it's a bad solution. So I tell people to kind of ignore their business brains. Pick a problem that's going to maintain your motivation. Think about picking a problem less as a business. Is this going to be a good business or not? And think about it more as, will this maintain my motivation for 10 plus years? Because a lot of doing a startup is this kind of mental hack of, can I stay in it long enough to do something good enough to actually build a good company? And the thing that slaughters most people quietly, and most young founders don't realize it, is just folks who give up. Most, the Paul Graham quote is that most startups commit suicide, they're not killed. And that suicide is usually caused by losing motivation. So you lose motivation, and then you get into a pivot cycle, and then you give up. You lose motivation, so then you get into a fight with your co-founder, and you give up. You lose motivation, so you stop building product and launching product, and your customers churn, and you give up. Right? It's the motivation piece that is the essential piece. And the motivation, you kind of can understand that much better from your heart than from your business mind.
Well, I think this is a really interesting point, because normally founders, what they see in the media is basically the success stories, right? And oftentimes they don't realize, how many dead bodies are basically underneath this one successful startup. And I think it's super important to explain to founders how difficult and painful this journey really is, and they should really think twice whether they want to start. So maybe could you just touch upon the journey of, let's say, Justin TV Twitch? How long it actually took to build this company to actually achieve product market fit, if that ever happens.
So Justin TV started in October 2006. We launched the first version of the product in the spring of 2007. This was the online reality TV show, Lifecasting. By the summer of 2007, we realized that that version of the product would not work. So we started building a platform for anyone to broadcast live video. By the fall of 2007, we launched that platform. That platform grew, but was dominated with copywritten content that we didn't own the rights for. So professional sports, movies, television. By about 2000 and let's see, by about 2010, we realized that that product could never really get true product market fit. That copyright owners would continue to want to take their content down, not want to work with us. And so that was not going to be a viable product. We got the business profitable that year and came up with two new ideas. One was social cam, one was Twitch. I would say that by mid 2011, both of those ideas were launched. And I would say that by mid 2012, it was becoming obvious that Twitch was hitting product market fit. It was growing organically with very high retention. And by the late summer 2014, Twitch sold for $1 billion. And so, yeah, that was an 8-year journey where only in the last 2 years was it clear that we were onto something. Needless to say, this is typically an anomaly. Most companies don't make it 6 years without true product market fit. But I think that they could. I think that they could. Like, I think the folks who don't find product market fit right away don't have to die as often as they do. So that was our story.
So we're moving forward towards product market fit, this sort of term that everybody's talking about, but I guess nobody really understands what it means. At least when I talk to entrepreneurs, it's really there are tons of different definitions and ways to measure it. So I'm really curious to know, how do you think about this concept? How do you define it? Is there a way to measure it, and how to go about it?
So I want to start by saying most founders who think they have product market fit are lying to themselves. And so once again, right, you have to understand default positions, right? Like, you need to understand the statistics. So you can, when you have a feeling, you can understand, am I just falling into a trap that everyone else is, right? And so, if the first default is that founders launch too late, the second default is that founders think they have product market fit when they don't. And what's interesting is that more and more, because fundraising is being put out in the press as a significant milestone, more and more founders believe they have product market fit, not when they're getting customer signals, but when they're getting investor signals. And that's very, very, very bad. So, as an example, most companies who raise a Series A think they have product market fit. Whereas, like, statistics show that probably only like 10% of companies that raise a Series A go on to build good companies. So what happened to those other 90%? They didn't have product market fit. It's so simple, but what happens when you think of an investor as your signal for product market fit is that you assume if someone hands you $5 to $10 million, they believe you got product market fit. And if they believe you have product market fit, well, then they're the expert, right? They're the investor. That makes them an expert, right? Who cares about the customer? Therefore, I must have product market fit. To me, the customer is the one who defines product market fit. And every founder knows deep down in their soul whether they're serving the customer well or not. And signs that you're serving the customer well are pretty simple, right? One, when they're using the product, are they using it fully? Are they actually achieving the result that you want them to achieve? Two, are they retaining? So if they have this problem, are they continuing to use your product to solve it? Or do they come to your product and then run away? Three, are they telling their friends? If they're using the product, it's solving their problem. They're retaining because it continues to solve their problem. And it's solving it well enough that their friends need to know about it. And then four is all of this happening within a functional business model? Is all of this happening in a way that you can actually build a business? Or are you giving away $1 worth of services and only making 75 cents back? So in my mind, when I'm trying to check for product market fit, I'm asking myself, do all 4 of those things line up? Can your product actually solve the problem? Do people actually keep using it? Do people tell their friends? And can the unit economics actually produce a large business with good margins? Weirdly, there are 2 things that founders will always tend to screw up. One, they will discount poor retention. In fact, many founders don't even measure retention. They want to talk about their users. Nobody cares about your user count. It's a number that only goes up. That is not a relevant or good number to track. The second thing is they will ignore the unit economics. They will say, oh, at scale, everything will work. In my experience, that's rarely the case. And so those are all 4 of the things that I think you need to have product market fit. Now, back in the day, you could raise a lot less money before your product market fit than today. But in my mind, what's interesting about product market fit is that the job of the founder switches from building good product to building a company, an organization that can actually further that product and scale that product once you have product market fit, not once you raise money. And so there are a lot of founders out there who are raising $5 to $10 million who should not be hiring, not be company building, not be building in execs. They should be continuing to hunt for product market fit. One of the biggest killers of YC companies are companies who raise an A, pre-product market fit, and then they immediately go into company building mode. They wake up 2 years later, having spent all the money, they look around at their nice office with all their employees, and they realize that they're about to go to business because their customers don't like their product.
So is there a way to somehow measure product market fit? Is it sort of a kind of a binary variable where you either have it or you don't? Is there a kind of magnitude of a product market fit? So, you know, some companies might have really strong product market fit and others, you know, like not that strong of a product market fit. Do you see that, or is it really just binary?
I think the experience, let's be clear, it depends on which industry you're in. But if you're in primarily a software dominated industry, I think the experience feels pretty binary. When you talk to founders, the experience switches from, we need to figure out what features to build in order to make our customers love our product, to, we need to just make sure our product is online. A lot of the conversation around new features dies off real fast. And it's like, it comes to, too many people want this. How do we deal with all the people who are coming through the front door? And that shift is the most common shift. When you hear founders actually talk about that, then you know there's real product market fit. And what's interesting, what most founders haven't really taken the time to think about is that most of the calls that I get when a company hits product market fit are negative. The founders are scared. They're like, you didn't tell us that product market fit is not fun. Every part of our software is breaking. We have customers calling us every day trying to get on, and we don't have enough room to support them. Like, every one of my team members says I'm understaffed. You need to hire more people now. We can't make it. And I've got 10 fires that are going at the same time, and I don't know which one to put out first. That's what product market fit feels like. And I love getting that phone call because I always tell the founders the same thing. You know, I'm sorry that we forgot to tell you that being post-product market fit is just as painful, if not more painful, than searching for product market fit.
Yeah, sometimes All right, so we also have some questions from the audience over Slido. So I encourage others to vote and ask Michael about what you want to ask him. There's a question from Max Kozlow that kind of relates to steps that founders should take when kind of trying to find the product market fit. And his question is, how would you recommend finding the perfect customer segment when it comes to trying to achieve product market fit?
So I walk founders through an exercise. One of the things that I think founders sometimes screw up is that they go after the hardest customers too early. So if you imagine the entire world of customers that you can go after, you don't get extra credit for going after those customers who kind of have the problem, are not willing to pay, and don't look like using startups. You don't get extra credit for helping those people. So I like to ask a founder, who are the people who are most likely to want to use you? Most desperate, most willing to pay, most willing to use startups to try. And let's just get those people first. And who cares if that's only 10% of your total market or 1% of your total market? That's a group of people that you can kind of bootstrap with to build the use cases, the case studies, the information, knowledge, the product that helps you go after the rest of the 90% of customers or 99% of customers. So this is a problem that I see way too often, is founders going after customers who are too hard, who are not inclined to use startup customers. And I just tell them to stop. I tell them that, like, on demo day, your revenue graph doesn't look different. You don't get to shade it in with a different color if you have hard customers versus easy customers. So you might as well just get the easy customers.
Right. And so when it comes to finding or looking for product market fit, what are the biggest mistakes that entrepreneurs do?
They don't look for it at all. The biggest mistake is what I call fake Steve Jobs. Fake Steve Jobs imagines the iPhone out of his head and then imagines every iteration purely in his head, never interacting with customers, never having the problem themselves. They just continue to live their startup in their head. Real Steve Jobs was a phone user before making an iPhone, built the phone he wanted as the MVP. If you remember in 2008, that phone sucked in many ways. It didn't have 3G. It didn't have an app store. It had horrible battery life. The glass on the front broke easily. That was an MVP. And then over the course of years, it was iterated with customer feedback. The founders that I see screwing up are the ones who don't even know they're screwing up. They're being fake Steve Jobs. They told themselves that all their insights had to come from their heads and none from the customers. The real Steve Jobs learned from customers and iterate and make mistakes and learn.
And on the opposite side, what are some of the best practices when it comes to looking for product market fit?
Metrics. Companies that measure new usage, retention, that do cohort analysis. The number of companies that I meet who don't understand their metrics, if you can't tell me how many people used your product today, how much money you made today, how many of the people who used your product today were new versus returning users. If you just throw some random Google Analytics tags around your site and you consider yourself metrics driven, or God forbid you use the metrics product in Firebase, whatever other fucking platform you're using, you are building a product, you're driving on a road blind. It's like we've blacked out all of your windows. You don't know what's going on. If you don't have metrics, how do you learn whether your customers like your product or not? How do you learn how to iterate? There's two parts of iteration. One is the qualitative feedback that you get from talking to customers and potential customers, and one is the quantitative feedback you get from actually seeing what they do with your product. If you only have one half of the story, you don't have the story.
So when I was doing my research for today's interview, I found one interesting topic, and that was the 90-10 rule. Could you talk a bit about that?
So this rule is inspired by Paul Buchheit, who was an early Google employee, the creator of Gmail, and also a partner at YC. And one of the things that PB always said is that great engineers are lazy. And another thing that he always pointed out was that like doing things perfectly is very hard, right? Like this is a concept that's very common in engineering. The last 10% of the job takes as much time as the first 90%. So PB came up with this concept of a 90-10 solution. If I'm trying to build something and I'm under-resourced, it's much better to build something that's 90% of what I want for 10% of the work than 100% of I want for usually 200% of the work. So when trying to think through how to build a new feature, how to iterate, how to build an MVP, he would always push us to basically answer the question, how do I get this 90-10 solution? And whenever we kind of learned this culturally inside of our companies, and so whenever we came up with an idea, the next challenge was, could we down-spec it? Could we figure out a 90-10 version of it where we get 90% of what we want for 10% of the work? And it turns out that that was always a great guiding philosophy, because if you're on to something, you can always do more work to make it better. But it's really hard to learn whether you're onto something before you get something out there in the world. So let's just get the thing out there, see how it works, and we can always iterate. And I also think it's very comforting to people. Oftentimes there are business and product people involved in a company who don't really understand how hard of an engineering task building a feature is. And oftentimes this concept is very helpful to these people because it forces them to down-spec projects, to make projects easier. It forces them to learn what makes a project hard to build versus easy to build. And over time, they start suggesting 90-10 solutions. And that's when you really get in the zone. When everyone in your company starts thinking, let me figure out the 90-10 solution to this, and let's push that forward. Needless to say, there are some areas where you have to be careful about 90-10 solutions, right? If you're building a healthcare startup that works with diabetic patients, I don't know if you want to have a 90-10 solution for whether someone should take insulin or not, right? So we have to put these things into context because now startups are covering so many different worlds. But I think that, in industries with customers and problems where you can't afford to do a 90-10 solution, we would always recommend it.
So basically what you're saying is that companies before achieving product market fit need to sort of really be perfect. They need to kind of optimize for efficiency in this way. And I think this is quite interesting concept. And I think in one of the latest of your tweets, you mentioned that best practices are oftentimes killing startups. Is it also, kind of expansion of this idea in a way?
Yeah, what's interesting is that here's a kind of a death spiral that I see. Everyone understands that large companies used to be fast and nimble, and now we're slow. And the reason why startups have opportunities is often because the incumbents in the space are slow. And so I think that, I wanted to think a little bit deeper around why. Why are companies that get big get slow? And I think that I've learned two things kind of thinking about this and talking to a lot of YC companies. The first is a well-intentioned thing, and the second isn't. The well-intentioned thing is that there's a whole class of people inside of your company who have a concept of what doing things well or right means. And usually that concept is defined by big companies. So what is HR doing things right? Well, it's having compensation plan and having ladders and having regular one-on-ones and having employee surveys. What is legal doing things right? It's having the right NDAs in place and all the legal paperwork filed correctly, and making sure that nobody talks about certain subjects at work if you're a regulated company. And so I think what happens is that in the process of these people doing their job, what they're being told is the right way. They don't realize that they're creating negative externalities to other parts of the organization. And these people exist in every part of the organization. Designers who say everything has to be designed by the design guidelines. Engineering managers who say that we need to have too many meetings. PMs that don't know how to use analytics, right? There's just so many, like as your org gets professionalized, there's so many of these people out there who they think they're doing right by the company, but in reality, they're causing all kinds of problems. I don't know what to do about that, other than make sure that you have product market fit before those people get in. Because eventually you have to hire those people, and it's not clear to me how to make them not destructive. There have been a couple ideas. Like one, can you measure? Maybe you can measure that destruction in some way. That would be nice, because if you can measure it, you can reduce it. The second thing was I've been told is that maybe people in these types of roles should always have to interview internal customers, the people inside of their companies who are actually kind of victims of their decision making. Because more often than not, they're looking to outside experts. They're not looking inside of the company when they're rolling out these solutions. The second group is I would argue, not well-intentioned. This is a group of people who are career builders. They want to spend 2 to 3 years at your company and get some credential, some item on their resume, some accomplishment that they can market to continue building their career and to go on to some other company. And unfortunately, like this group of people is very attracted to companies that look like they're taking off. They like to kind of collect fancy logos on their resume. But oftentimes their motivation to get a personal win can come at the expense of their teammates or of their company. Because needless to say, they're not here for the company to win. They're here to make sure they get their thing done. And so when you see a company with a company post-product market fit that's getting big, that has an explosion of new features that don't work well, this is often a sign that this group of people have come in because they want to have some product on the resume. Oh, I launched da-da-da-da, right? That's a nice accomplishment for a 2-year period of time. But they're not gonna be there to make sure the product actually works or survives or thrives or has high retention or has good economics. So their motivations are all screwed up. What I find frustrating are companies in company building mode not understanding the problems that their incumbents had, and therefore making the same mistakes the incumbents did. If you build your company in the wrong way, you leave a massive door open for a startup to come disrupt you. And if you make all the same mistakes and you're just as inefficient and you're just as slow and you're just as divorced from your customers as the incumbent was that you defeated, you will become that incumbent. And I don't find founders spending enough time worrying about that. I find too many startup founders build a company that they themselves could immediately disrupt.
We have another interesting question from the audience. Marek is asking, what is more important for building a successful company? A great product or an excellent team?
I would always say an excellent team. Products have to change. Products have to improve over time. Products have to improve with competition, with technology. If you have a bad team, you won't be able to do that iteration. And others will be able to see your product and copy it. If you have a good team, you can stay ahead of that innovation.
Well, I think, like I might have a follow-up question to this one, and that is, how is the market playing a role in this?
Can you be more specific?
Well, I think it was it was, I think, Andy Rachleff, who was basically talking about, teams, products, and markets. And basically, he was saying that even if you have a great team and a great product, if the market is not there, basically the company will not be able to survive or succeed. So how do you think about this?
So one of the things that I like to say is that startups are a multivariable problem, and startup founders have to embrace the complexity. A lot of founders want to reduce their startup to a single variable problem because it's easier to understand, right? And so thus comes the question, great team or great product, right? The real answer to the question is both. Sorry. The real answer is that to succeed in this world where 99.999% of people fail, you have to do many things right and be lucky. And reducing this to product or team, growth or retention, is just always bullshit. It's always garbage, right? It's like, hey, do you want a basketball team that can shoot well but not able to dribble? Or a basketball team that can dribble well but only shoot layups? You're like, no, I reject those choices. Both of those teams will lose. I'd like a team that can pass, dribble, and shoot well. Of course. And so to me, though, everything starts with a good team. And the reason why is that a strong technical team, in my experience, can learn the other skills. And startup teams are not static. They develop during the time of the startup. And so a strong technical team can figure out business, can figure out press, metrics, customer interviews, sales, fundraising. They can figure out those other things. They can learn those things on the fly. It is rarer, I think basically unheard of, that you can take two business people and teach them how to code while doing their startup. That is almost impossible.
So we talked about how difficult it is to actually achieve product market fit and how few startups actually achieve it. And my last question would be, what happens if a startup is not able to achieve product market fit? What then?
So I think that one thing that we should acknowledge from the get-go is that this startup world isn't easy and most people fail. And failure is okay. Like you have permission to fail. If you're trying to do something extremely hard, it's okay to fail. I would say that when you see companies who are in the position where they're no longer inspired, they should either shut down or pivot. And I think that either of those paths can work. But one of the things that really drives both of those paths are the relationship between the co-founders. If you have a co-founding team that has some pre-existing relationship, people who really enjoy working together, they can motivate themselves through pivots. If you have a team that you thought you built of all-stars, right, who have all these complementary skills, but actually don't know each other well and don't end up liking each other that much, more often than not, it's better to shut that company down. And so when we think about starting conditions for a company, right, it's interesting because we kind of build this map of good starting conditions, right? One is a technical team. Two is a team that knows each other well. Three is a team where at least someone is solving a personal problem that's going to maintain the motivation even through dark times. And four is a team that can build 90-10 solutions and get them into the hands of customers and learn from the customers. What's interesting is that most early stage startups are screwing up at least one, if not multiple of those things. One of the things that makes this game so hard is not that you don't know what to do. Nothing that I've said here today should be very revelatory. It's all written online by 20 different people in 20 different ways. The hard part is that most people aren't doing it. And so to me, like kind of the last message I want to leave people is that effective people figure out how to do hard things. Everything I've said today is hard. It's obvious. It's not like it's hidden, but it's hard. Effective people figure out how to do hard things. Ineffective people convince themselves they don't need to do hard things. One of the biggest mistakes I made as a founder was that thinking that hard things come easier to some people than others. And it gave me the excuse to shy away from hard things. And only recently in my life have I realized that people who are more effective than you, their life isn't easier. They've just trained themselves to be better at doing hard things. And if they can train themselves to be better at doing hard things, you can train yourself to be better at doing hard things. And so you should kind of seek in, that you should lean into that hardness, and you should understand that you can learn and you can improve.
So we still have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Anonymous user is asking, what is the biggest misconception about YC?
Oh, there's so many. Oh my God. Okay. I'm going to split them up into two chunks. There's admissions misconceptions, and then there's what the experience of YC are misconceptions. So the admissions misconceptions tend to be, I am a type of company that's not right for YC. I heard YC only funds blank type of companies, and that's not me. That is almost exclusively wrong, no matter what blank is, as long as you're trying to use software to solve a big problem in the world. If you're trying to use software to solve a big problem in the world, we have funded a company in your industry or in your region. I promise you. And if you just go to ycombinator.com/companies, you can find them. You can find the industries, you can find the countries. So that's the first one. The second kind of flavor of that is I'm either too far along or not far along enough to do YC. Once again, this is based on false information. You know, we funded a company in this batch that's doing over $250,000 of revenue per month. Is that what you're doing? I know companies that have raised $20 million that aren't making that much revenue. So you're not going to be in bad company because they'll be in the batch with you. On the other hand, there are founders who just started writing code a month before they applied to YC. So if you're very early, you'll be in good company as well. So those are the admissions mistakes. It's opting out of YC for some dumb and verifiable reason, because instead of getting ground truth, primary information, you relied on some secondary expert, like your stupid friend, or like some advisor who doesn't know anything, or some investor who doesn't know anything, instead of just going and getting the information yourself. And it's on our fucking website, so it's pretty easy to get. Number two, and I think this is the most important one. This came from a YC founder, actually. And so I'll just kind of quote him directly. Most people think about a YC as a school. In a school, you have a lean back experience. The teacher gives you a syllabus, they tell you what to study, what to read, which lectures to go to, and then they test you based on that material. A school is kind of set up to help you succeed by walking you through a predefined path. That's not YC. YC is a set of resources that you get access to, and then you have to learn to use, both during the batch and afterwards. And if you don't use those resources, they'll just sit there. If you do, you'll get far more value out of YC than the amount of equity that you give. But whether you're getting a good deal or not is almost exclusively based on you, not based on YC. It's based on how you use the resources. And the one thing that I like to kind of inspire founders by is that someone is getting double the value out of YC. Someone in your batch, multiple companies, right? We ask for 7%, multiple companies are getting 14% of value. If you're not them, why not? Why not? Why aren't you extracting more than you gave? Because the resources are there. You can do it if you choose to. And so I think those are the two major categories of misconceptions. We're not a school. We won't teach you how to build a billion-dollar company. Anyone who tells you they'll teach you how to build a billion-dollar company is lying to you.
There's another question from the audience, and I think it relates to your experience as an entrepreneur. How did you support your team during the long years before achieving product market fit? Did you raise money? Have you been burning money during the most of the time?
Yeah, we raised money. We raised, well, back then, all of the numbers will seem small. So we raised our initial seed capital, I think that was $50,000 at $1 million valuation. We raised our, what would be called angel round now, I think a little under 200,000 at a $3.5 million valuation. We ran out of money and our founders had to, two of our co-founders, Justin and Emmett, had to give us a $40,000 loan out of their personal bank accounts to allow us to survive. We raised the Series A of $2 million at an $8 million valuation. We raised a Series B of, I think, about $4 million in equity and $3 million in debt, something like that, at a $18 million valuation. And then we raised, well, after that, we got profitable, which was nice. Then Twitch started exploding, and we raised 2 additional rounds of financing before selling to Amazon. So yeah, lot of fundraising involved.
Another question from Max Kozlow. What would you say are the best pillars for building a strong team and good company culture? The
best tip is that you have to care enough to change how you act. So company culture is built on how the founders act or don't act. And if you can't change yourself, you can't influence others. If you can't bring your best self to work, you're not gonna get the best out of other people. So almost all company culture things start with what are you and your co-founders doing and not doing? How are you making it your workplace a more motivational or a less motivational place? When it comes with team, the most common mistake that I see made is non-technical founders discounting software. I get the quote, we're not building a software company, it's just software enabled. And I say to founders like that, okay, well, imagine that your competitor, the startup your competitor, is doing the same thing that you're doing, but they have an amazing software team. Should I invest in them or you? Who's gonna win? And they don't like that question, most founders, when I ask that. And so I would say that like the most common mistake is relying on outsourced engineering. And like, so it's weird. It's like the most common mistake is like screwing up the first most important thing, which is like, if you're building a software company, one of your core competencies should be building software. And that doesn't mean that you need to have some CTO with 25 years experience. But if you find yourself paying some dev shop $10, $20, $30,000, paying an army of Upwork workers, like this isn't the game. That's not the game. That's not how this game works. All right, and the final question from the audience, I think it's a great final question actually. How do you see Y Combinator in 5 years? So I would say that the secret advantages of YC have changed. So the early secret advantage of YC, the reason why founders should do YC was that no one else would fund them. We were the only people funding young technical founders in 2005. It was, you know, just the aftermath of the tech crash of the early 2000s. So that was the first reason to do YC. I'd say the second reason to do YC was as the reputation grew, fundraising. Demo day was very, very powerful. And so even founders who could raise money could raise more money if they did YC. So I would say over the last 5 years, there's become a third reason. And that's the reason that we want to deepen and expand. And that's customers. It turns out that like getting access to customers and being able to use the YC network to generate more revenue faster than your competition can is actually a much more enduring advantage. It's a much more enduring thing for YC to give you than anything else. And so a lot of our focus over the last 5 years has been to help you get customers. And that's what a lot of our focus is going to be moving forward, both for consumer products and for B2B products, is how can we make it easier for you to sell within the YC network? And what's interesting about that is that there are YC people, not only running companies, but who have worked for and who work in the future for very successful companies in many different industries. And so the YC network is very wide and only expanding. And I think that that's going to be the biggest advantage over the next 5 years is, can YC get you to $100,000 in monthly revenue faster than your competition?
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. This was fun for me, and hopefully the audience also enjoyed it. And I hope that in the next batch of Y Combinator, you're going to have much more CE startups, or at least much more applying startups from CE. So I hope at least we achieve this with the interview. And I also would like to recommend everybody watching this who wants to learn more about how to succeed as an entrepreneur. Follow Michael on Twitter, check out his web and his blog, and Y Combinator blog, with tons of resources for entrepreneurs. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Michael, once again. Have a great day, and over to Barbara.
Thanks a bunch. See you later.